Hello and welcome to our webcast today on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. That is the Department of Defense's new regulatory requirement for suppliers to the DoD. We are glad you are here today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Scott Dawson with Core Business Solutions. Today we're going to cover the basics of CMMC for those of you just trying to figure out what is this and how does it work and how does it affect me and my organization. So I'll be covering those topics here today with a couple of special guests that we have. So again, thanks for being here. Now we've invited a number of organizations around the U.S. to co-sponsor today's webcast. You'll see a list of those on the screen here. We very much appreciate the MEPs and PTACs and registrars and associations that have gotten behind this session here today. It was probably from one of these partners of ours that you received an invitation to join us here today. This is the first of a 6-part series on CMMC. We'll be doing one per month, taking us through to the fall. But we're going to start today with the overview of CMMC. Now, today's agenda is what is CMMC all about? And secondly, we'll talk about the DFARS regulation. This is a new requirement that has came in to the Defense Industrial Base last November. It is now a requirement to get a contract with the DoD. So we'll talk about the DFARS Interim Rule, followed by how does this apply to me, or I'll say it a different way, to whom does this apply? How does this apply to you? What certification might you need to pursue? There are 2 certification levels that are likely going to be required of your organization. One of these 2 would be required. The vast majority of defense contractors will either need Level 1 CMMC certification or Level 3, and we'll distinguish the difference between those as we go through this today. And we'll wrap up with a discussion about timeline and costs. So let's get started talking about what is CMMC. So CMMC, to begin with, stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. That's the CMMC. First thing we notice is that it's geared towards cybersecurity. It's geared toward protection of data on your network and your computers. And specifically, it's there to protect sensitive information that is either provided by the Defense Department or your prime contractor, or that you produce and provide to them. It's all that technical and contractual information that needs to be protected. So it's not designed to protect your financial information in your company or your employee information or even your other customer information. It's specifically designed to protect Defense Department documentation. Secondly, we notice is it's a certification. We'll learn more about what that means, but if you are ISO 9001 certified or AS 9100 certified, I know many of you are, you'll find that this kind of operates in a similar fashion with an external auditor coming in periodically. And finally, we notice it's a maturity model. Maturity model basically means that there's a progression of levels or steps to go through as you secure your information. For some companies, they'll only need that basic level. For others, they'll need to go further with regard to maturity. Now, certification is done through organizations called CMMC, Third-Party Assessment Organizations, or C3PAO. C3PAO is the acronym. Those are the assessment firms that will conduct the audits as you get certified. There are 5 levels of certification in CMMC, level 1 being the lowest level of security, level 5 being the highest. And once you're certified, there's a 3-year window until you're certified again. So it needs to be refreshed once every 3 years. But it's unlike ISO and AS certification in that the auditor comes every 3 years. They don't come in the intermediate years for surveillance audits where ISO audits are done annually. These are only done every 3 years. The way you will know which certification level is required and when you have to be certified is going to be found in your customer contracts related to your defense contracts, whether that's a prime contract to a government, an agency in the government, or a contracting office in the Defense Department, or you are a subcontractor contracting with a prime. It's through the contract that you will start to see CMMC Level 1 or CMMC Level 3 being specified. And what that will mean is you have to be certified to be awarded that contract. So the deadline is the award of the first contract that has CMMC required. The CMMC assessments will begin later this year. The assessors right now are going through training and qualification. They, first of all, have to be certified themselves. So that's what's going on this year, is getting all the assessors prepared to begin audits later this year. And there's a 5-year window through 2026 by which all defense contracts will require CMMC certification. So over the course of those 5 years, they will gradually add CMMC into the various contracts until it's then required for all 350,000 defense contractors in the defense industrial base. But why did all this come about? Let's talk about the objectives. First of all, this is all about securing defense-related information. There's some information that's less sensitive and other information that's more sensitive. What are we talking about? We're talking about what's called FCI and CUI, Federal Contract Information Controlled Unclassified Information. This is information that if it were jeopardized or if it were stolen by our nation's adversaries, they could use it against us in some fashion. So this is all the information we need to keep it secure. We need to keep technical information like drawings and specifications and software code and other types of things. We need to keep that protected as it flows up and down through the supply chain. And there's contract information that needs to remain private as well. So it's the FCI and CUI that's being protected from being infiltrated or exfiltrated, I guess they call it, from one of your network or your supplier's network or your customer's network. The second objective is to have one certification that is applicable to the entire Defense Department. So we don't need to see the Air Force having one requirement, the Army and the Marines having another requirement. They've settled on one requirement, one certification that's required by all of the branches of the military. And by the way, other agencies in the U.S. government are looking at CMMC for perhaps adopting that throughout the government. So right now it's only for the Defense Department, but there's a lot of interest in this whole approach. And finally, there's a requirement to verify that cybersecurity practices have been implemented and then to sustain those by having recertification. So that's the element of the assessors coming to certify your company. Now, these are not new requirements. It's just a new approach to those requirements. The cybersecurity requirements have been part of government contracting for years. That is, one way is in the FAR 52, 20470, or 20421. That has been in regulation for many years for all government contracts. And there are 17 basic cyber practices like changing your password, use a firewall, put antivirus on your computers, things like that. Those have been part of the regulations with contracting with the federal government for years. Now they've been rolled into CMMC, so it's no longer just an honor system, there's actually certification. And then secondly, the Defense Federal Acquisition Register Supplement, otherwise known as DFARS, 252-204-7012, that is the regulation that has been in place since 2017 that requires more advanced practices for protecting of CUI. There are 110 requirements in that regulation, but my point is only cybersecurity has been a requirement by the government, by the Defense Department, and now they're just moving it to that next level of certification. Now, I've mentioned FCI. That's the federal contract information. That is information not intended for public release, supposed to remain private, that is provided by or generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government. So all the contractual information that's exchanged during the proposal phase, the RFP phase, the award phase, and all the information to maintain that contract that is sent by the government or by your organization to your customer, that information is what we're talking about protecting. It's not necessarily technical, it's more contractual, but all that information is being protected through CMMC Level 1, excuse me. Now, CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information, is information the government creates or possesses that on an entity like yourself, like your company, creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency like your company to handle using safeguarding or dissemination controls. Boy, that sounds like a government statement, doesn't it? But what they're basically saying is there is more sensitive technical information like drawings and specifications, as we've mentioned, that will require CMMC Level 3, whether the government provides it and sends it to your organization or vice versa. You produce it as a deliverable and provide it to your customer. All that information is called CUI. Let's look at a few examples. So you can see here, this was taken from the CUI website from the DoD, where just as examples, you can see engineering drawings, specifications, standards, data sets, software code, and more. There is a link that will be included in the presentation you'll have access to after today's session that you'll be able to find the website that explains what information is CUI and the kind of examples they'll give. Now, long-term, the government plans to mark all this documentation with CUI at the top of the page, CUI at the bottom of the page, so that it's clear to you what information is to be protected. But right now, it's not all marked. In fact, very few of the documents are marked clearly. So how do you approach that when you're trying to sort out what information to protect and what information doesn't need to be protected? The easiest thing, the shortcut to that is just treat everything related to that contract, everything under that program or that project for that customer. Just protect all of it as if it was CUI and protect it on your network in the fashion required by CMMC. So that would be kind of the safe approach to protecting CUI until it's more clearly defined. But don't expect that to happen soon. They've been working on it for more than 7 years. So, all right, let's shift gears and let's talk about the newest regulation called the DFARS Interim Rule. And to talk about this, we are going to bring in a special guest, a good friend of mine. He's one of our lead consultants on CMMC, Mr. Rick Crick. Thank you for joining us, Rick. I know you're working from home today and appreciate you joining us. So, Rick, we're going to talk about these new regulations that people need to be aware of because as of November 30th last year, these are required to be awarded a contract. If you don't meet these regulations, you can't receive a defense contract starting December 1st last year. But the first requirement we're going to talk about is called DFARS 252.204-7012. We're going to abbreviate from now on. I'll call it 7012. But this is a regulation that has been on the books for 7 years. It's been a requirement in all defense contracts for 7 years. What essentially is required today?
Well, basically, the DoD is requiring its suppliers, contractors, subcontractors to have a plan in place to meet the NIST 800-171 requirements. There are two areas that focuses on. One is in the area of documentation, and the second area is a registration.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about the documentation.
Yeah, what documents specifically are we talking about?
The document is an SSP and a POAM. That is a self-assessment that you do about your system Am I compliant? Aren't I compliant? And so as we create this document, system security plan document, we address those two areas, come up with what we're missing and a date that we plan to get everything in place. So this is a compliance, not a certification. We have to have a plan to get there where we have all of the controls in place. And there's 110 controls, as you mentioned earlier.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm following. So the System Security Plan, SSP, documents your current state, basically, where you are with regard to meeting the requirements of this other government document. It's called NIST SP 800-171. We're not yet talking CMMC. This is a different document. It's been around for years, and it includes 110 requirements. So SSP is one. And what's the POAM again?
The POAM is your plan of action and milestones. It is determining when we're going to get those missing controls in place.
Yep.
So that is the importance there, that, okay, we may not have everything in place today, but this is our plan to get it in place.
Okay, so there's self-assessment, generate the POAM and SSP, and then you talked about registration. What is that?
Yeah, there is a registration that is required through the DIBnet portal, and it is getting an ID number so that if you have a security issue, you can report it to the DoD. It's proactive. You don't wait till you have a security issue before you go ahead and try to log on, because it takes some time to get that ID number. So yeah, you want to be proactive and get that ID number so that if an issue does occur, you can submit it appropriately.
Okay, we have a link in our presentation. We'll send everyone afterward. They could follow that link to learn more about DIBnet registration. So now we're going to talk about the new regulations. Those are called 252, 204, 7019, 7020, 7021. These are new as of December 1st last year. Let's talk about 7019. That ups the pressure on contractors, I think, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. As of November 30th, it requires that all contractors looking to do new business has to submit a score to the SPRS database.
Yeah.
What that means is that you have to provide information based on your self-assessment and register that into their database. Okay,
so there's a defense acquisition methodology you have to follow, right?
Yes, there is. So there is the DoD assessment methodology, which goes through and looks at every particular control or practice and assigns a value to that.
Okay.
Just generally speaking, you start out with 110 points. They're assuming you have everything in place, and you can go as low as negative 203.
Yeah, it's kind of goofy how it goes negative. We'll show an example here in a moment, and then that result gets submitted to the Supplier Performance Review System, or SPRS. Let's move to the next one. That is the requirement for the government to do some spot checks or their own audits of these scores, right? That's 7020.
Yes. Yeah, I look at this as, an interim check until the CMMC becomes a viable thing for everyone. And so they can do a on-site or a virtual audit. And it's to check to see that everything that we said we are, everything we are meeting, we're actually meeting within the SPRS database in our self-assessment. It's not going to be everybody. Once again, it's just a spot check.
Yeah.
My guess is it's primarily would be looking at more of the primes than the subs.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's done by the what's called the DIBCAC organization from the federal government. All right, the final regulation is 7021. This is the big one that requires from a regulatory or legal perspective full CMMC certification. So what's in that one?
Yeah, the CMMC has 130 controls. There are 20 more controls than the NIST. So the NIST 800-171 has 110. All 110 of those are carried over into the CMMC. there's about 14 controls or practices which have very minor wording changes, maybe some punctuation. And then there's additional 20 controls. Many of those are an expansion of the existing controls. Yeah. There are a few more controls that are new. But unlike the NIST 800-171, the CMMC, you have to have everything in place. There is no POAM or plan of action milestone.
There's no POAM. That's the big deal. So you have to ace the test when it comes time to certification. You can't get a B- or a C+. You've got to get an A+ to get certified at whatever level you apply to. And 7021 basically says CMMC is now going to be a regular requirement by contract as the Defense Department rolls that out over the next 5 years. All right, very good. That's enough about the regulatory stuff. Who does this affect? What are the regulations actually referred to when we talked about who it affects? And let me just address that for a moment here. Basically, they're saying any contractor or subcontractor that handles FCI or CUI has to get certified. That's actually in the text of the requirement. If you handle FCI, it's a level 1 certification. If you handle CUI, it's a level 3 requirement. Level 2 is not going to be used for certification. It's only a milestone for companies who are implementing level 3. The simple way to look at this is, if you want to know if level 3 certification is for you, look in your current contracts. Look for a reference to DFARS 252.204/7012. See if that's currently required. If so, then that particular contract will eventually require CMMC Level 3. Now, we talked about the SPURS score and the defense, or it was a defense assessment score. The DAM, there's a methodology that they want us to use that's kind of based on a point system. We put a page from that up on the screen here. Briefly, what is this? How does this work?
Well, every particular control that you have has a you can get 5 points, you can get 3 points, or 1 point. Not sure what happened to 2 and 4. Yeah. But it is a DoD after all. And so the DoD assumes that you have everything in place. Therefore, you start out with a score of 110. And as you go down through the controls, if there are any controls that you do not have in place, you subtract those points. So if you have nothing in place, you could have a negative 203, like we mentioned earlier. Yeah. So as you go through your point system, or going through there, you'll see what your score would be, maximum of 110.
So to be awarded any defense contract from this point forward, that would be as a prime or as a sub at any tier, you have to generate this score. You have to assess yourself, that's the first point, using this tool, generate the total score that you get from that, and submit that to the SPURS database. So let's talk a bit about this information required to submit. What do you have to do to submit the information?
So there's just a couple of pieces of information that you need to submit. One is that score we just got done talking about. The other is the date that you plan to get all of the controls in place. So as you went through and did your POAM, plan of action and milestone, the further stayed out is that date that you would put into there when you will meet that score of 110. Yep. The other thing they're interested in is, when did you do your assessment? And they want that date as well. So those are the key factors.
And so the defense contracting officer will be able to look in the SPURS database to see if you've submitted a score. If you haven't, you're not eligible to receive a contract. If you have, you're eligible. It's kind of a go, no go at this point. The actual point total isn't supposed to matter, but I will tell you, if I have a negative 200 score, I probably don't want to submit a negative 200 score, right?
Yep,
all right, so Rick, let's just summarize here. The assessment is done using the the DoD assessment methodology. That's based on the NIST 800-171. Then document your system security plan and POAM. Now you have a date by which you're going to be fully compliant with the NIST standard, and you're ready to submit to the SPRS database. Did I get it?
You got it. That's correct.
All right, Rick, thanks for your time today. Appreciate you joining us.
You're welcome.
All right. All right. Well, thank you to Rick Crick for joining us here today. I want to show you how this might work then. We're going to look at an example. I'm going to bring up a tool that we use with our clients to go through the self-assessment and to generate the scores as we go through that. So as we bring this up on the screen, give that just a moment to come up. We are going to look at what's called our core compliance platform. It's our product. And you can see this is set up specifically to help clients get prepared for certification. And there's a number of folders for documentation and other type things that we'll look at in future episodes. But for today, we're going to focus on that self-assessment score to the SPRS database process. So we have a tool up here I can bring up that lists out the various controls. And for each of the 110 requirements, you'll see there's information to explain. You can also watch a video to explain. So as you're trying to learn these things for the first time, you'll notice we have videos available for each control. And then you're able to document your current state and whether there's a risk that you have from a security point of view, and develop your plans and your action items here. What will happen automatically in the core platform is it will generate the score. So if we look up here on our dashboard, you'll notice I currently have a score of 46 out of 110, which totals to a negative number of 82 points. As I implement more things, the point score will go up. This will make it easy for me to see the point score and my target completion date to be 100% compliant. That's the information you would need to submit to SPRS. So we'll look more in depth at the core platform in future episodes, but I think that gives us a quick snapshot here for today. Next, we're going to shift gears again, bring in another special guest to talk about who does CMMC apply to. So we're going to bring us a good friend of mine from Real IT Care, Mr. Zane Padalev, who lives just down the road. Hello, Mr. Zane.
Hey, Scott. How are you today?
Hey, Real IT Care is a leading IT firm here in central Pennsylvania where we live and work. And they work with small businesses to get compliant with CMMC. We actually work with Real IT Care to support our clients from a technical and a consulting point of view. So Zane, again, thanks for joining us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm going to have us get started drilling into the final area of regulatory that Rick and I just talked about. That's the 252-204-7021 requirement. That's I call it the big enchilada. That's the one that requires certification as it flows down through the defense industrial base. So just touch on what are the regulatory requirements in that requirement, in that regulation.
On the 7021?
7021, yep.
Yeah, as far as introducing the CMMC as a requirement for each company to be certified to, that either holds federal contract information or controlled unclassified information.
Yeah, so this is the one that actually makes it a legal contractual requirement to be certified. They'll be rolling this out over the next 5 years, but it's already in regulation now. Now,
correct.
Zane, as we talk about who this all applies to, there's different levels of information. Some of it is more sensitive than other. How does that correlate to the level of certification that's required?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. And in the government's pursuit of improving cybersecurity, complexity perhaps increases a tiny bit. So instead of previous, we had the NIST 800-171, which was one set of controls to govern CUI. Now we have 5 levels of protection or certification, which is dependent upon the level of data as you're talking about, the secure or the sensitivity of the data that is at hand. So primarily companies are going to have to deal with just 2 of the 5 settings or levels. So level 1 is the base level for companies that receive federal contract information, which most of the federal contract information is public domain. So you can look online, see the register, and see this information. But parts of it are still sensitive and need to be protected. For those companies that have federal contracts, they would be subject to the level 1, CMMC level 1 controls. For those that then receive controlled unclassified information, so the data that the NIST 800-171 was protecting, those companies then have to certify to level 3 in order to meet the cybersecurity requirements that the government is putting in place.
Now, there are a couple of exceptions, right, that of companies who might be somewhere in the defense industrial base that this doesn't apply to. And everyone's got their fingers crossed now before you tell us what those exceptions are.
Yeah.
So who is not required to meet these regulations?
Yeah, and it's a very small subset. So more than likely, companies are not going to fall into this. But the first would be those that have what's called COTS product, which is commercial off the shelf. So if you were to sell a bolt, for instance, I manufacture bolts, I sell them to the government. It's the exact same bolt that I sell to everybody. So if the government's saying, I just need one of those, then you're a COTS provider and you're not subject to these requirements. On the other hand, if the government says, I need that standard bolt that you sell to everybody, but I need this special coating on it, we're no longer COTS because there's some change to the product. It's not really off the shelf.
So if it's developed for the government, it's not COTS. If it's sold generally, it could be considered COTS. You need to clarify that make sure that's true. I was going to use paper clips instead of bolts in my example, but both works. Now, there's another exception, and that would be micro purchases, right? What's a micro purchase?
So micro purchase, and I saw 2 numbers on this. It's purchases that are under $10,000, and then I saw another one that said $20,000. So I'm not sure where that number officially falls.
I think it's 10, but you ought to double check to see if you qualify. If a contract you have is of a lower dollar amount, certainly under 10, then this would not be relevant. But anyone who doesn't provide COTS or is working a contract over the minimum threshold of 10,000, this applies to. There are 5 levels of certification, right? Which are the 2 most common?
Right. So level 1 would apply to those that have FCI, the federal contract information, and then level 3 for CUI. So that would be everyone else. There are levels 4 and 5, which are primarily, I think, going to be in the nuclear and some very specific armament contracts. The government wasn't expecting less than 0.5% would fall into those categories. So very few people are going to need to certify there. Level 2 is kind of an odd level because they treat it as a stepping stone to get to level 3. So I'm not sure if any company really would certify to level 2 because it doesn't exist within the contracting language. It's, you're either 1 or you're going to be 3.
Yeah, very good. Well, so let's next talk about how this is going to flow down through the defense industrial base. And I put a diagram on the screen here we can look at. Basically, this illustrates an example of a prime contractor who has a contract that then documentation is passed to their subcontractors to then specify those requirements. And if those subcontractors received CUI, as illustrated here, then they would be required for level 3. But you can see as it goes down through the different levels, there may be contracts that don't involve CUI. and therefore level 1 would be required. So it's always just, you heard follow the money. Well, this is follow the CUI, right? And you'll know how those regulations are going to flow down to really affect all 350,000 companies that are somewhere.
Right.
I didn't put that illustration on here. I thought the print would be a little too small. All 350,000. But let's drill into level 1 requirements, Zane, next.
Yeah.
So level 1 has 17 requirements. They came from the FAR, I'll abbreviate, the FAR 52 regulation that's been on the books for years. And there are different kinds of requirements. We've illustrated that in this diagram to give a sense of what is required for government contracts generally under this current requirement, and then what will be required for CMMC Level 1. So some examples, let's talk about what might have to happen with user accounts and passwords, that one there in the middle.
Yeah, and on the level 1, as you said, it comes from the FAR, so it's not the DFARS, it's not the defense specific clause. Theoretically, every company that has a government contract already should have these in place. So
that's right.
This really isn't anything
These
new.
are the basics.
Right. And the nice thing with the level 1 is we don't need to prove through a lot of written documentation to support that these are in place. We just have to make sure they're in place so that we can demonstrate that they're effective and in place.
Yep.
So there are a number of controls, even though it's only 17. So for instance, we need a way to control authentication of our network. We have to know who's on our network or our PCs by the name. So I can't have like secretary 1, office person 1, shop user 1. It has to be Bob, Sam, Sally.
Traceable in that sense, right?
Yeah, we need named users. So we need some means of doing that, which larger companies would have something called like an Active Directory server or associated cloud service that I can control that user authentication. Smaller companies that don't have that server would have to do this at the local PC level. So there's an increased level of administration that may be required.
So that's an example of a technical requirement that really the IT resources in your company would set up. But let's flip to a non-technical thing about visitors and facility access. What's required there?
Right. So there's 4 of the requirements are around physical access and escort policy. So if anybody comes to my facility, I need to ensure, first of all, that there's a visitor log so we know who's coming in and there's some record of that visit. An escort policy, so if copier repairman comes in or someone comes in to work at my CNC mill for maintenance, that individual, unless they're previously vetted, need to be monitored their entire time they're on site, and there needs to be a policy in place, and then that policy needs to be followed.
So there's a mix. There's a mix of technical, non-technical kinds of things, but they're all pretty basic. They're pretty basic. Now let's bump up to level 3 and look just quickly at the topics, what they call the domains. There are 17 domains, topics, if you will, that organize the 130 practices of CMMC Level 3. There's a lot to this one, a lot more to this one than the 17 that we just saw practices. Right. We're talking about 130. So pick one of these out that just to kind of illustrate an additional requirement.
Right. So incident response, and probably perhaps the easier items to solve are the technical ones, even though they are a little bit deep, but the policies and the procedures. So incident response plan, I need to have a documented solution in hand in case an incident is discovered on my network. And then also with CMMC, we need some examples of what to expect. So it takes the incident response from the NIST 800-171 and it adds a few more controls to it, makes it deeper.
Yeah.
Media protection. What are we doing for the removable media within
thumb
our
drives,
organization?
thumb drives, things like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Risk management, physical protection. It gets deeper. So the level 1, sort of think of it as a rudimentary framework. The level 3 takes that same framework and then makes it a lot deeper.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, and we mentioned that there's a mix of different types of security practices. There's kind of a percentage mix. Some are organizational, some are technical. How do those break out in the CMMC level 3?
Yeah, and your diagram is good. So roughly 60-40, plus or minus 5%. But the technical, and they're tightly related. So the technical controls we can put into place, but we have to have them documented for procedure so we can instruct our staff on how to follow these controls. So they are tightly connected. And this project, you cannot just give this to your IT people and say, do this for me.
That's right.
This is a joint project with the upper management, with IT, and it touches multiple departments within an organization to comply.
Yeah, so they really need a team effort to pull this thing off within an organization. Okay, Zane, one last point I wanted you to help us with is this idea of process maturity. So we know that's in the name, the CMMC, the maturity model. And on this particular diagram on the left-hand side, you can see the titles of the 5 levels of certification from level 1 to level 5 under practices. Practices simply means requirements. So that's the 17 or the 130 requirements for certification. But to the right, there's this other, aspect of demonstration that you need to be prepared to go through with regard to certification. Level 1, you need to perform the 17 practice. Level 3, you have to do more than just perform or demonstrate them, right? How does that work?
Right. Yeah, so this brings another layer of confusion to quite a few people. But what this is boiling down to, as I said, with the level 1, we just need to do all of these things, the 17 controls. We don't necessarily need to have a real documented evidence of these in place. It just need to be in place. An auditor would come in and make sure they're in place and they're working.
Yeah.
As we move up from level 2 to level 3, now we need to show that these are that we have evidence for all of the controls. So somebody, and it's 2 forms of evidence, that an auditor would, perhaps interview somebody, would look at a policy, would look at an actual control, would test. They may plug their computer into the network, make sure they can't get access. So there needs to be the evidence, but then there also needs to be the maturity side, that it needs to be in place. And the 2 words they use is persistent and habitual. Mm-hmm. And then the difficulty with this is to say, well, how long does it need to be in place in order for me to satisfy the auditor that this is persistent and habitual? So clearly, I can't just have all of my controls in place the day before the auditor comes. Even if they're 100% perfect, they haven't been in place long enough to be considered persistent and habitual. So on the town meetings with the CMMC AB, many questions come up. How long is long enough that we have proven track record? And there's no real answer. It's sort of like, I know it when I see it. So
I know it when I see it, because they need to see that this is part of your business, right? It's part of your culture. It's part of the habits of the organization. And I think the bottom line of all of this is you cannot wait till the last minute.
Right.
You can't have a 'twas the night before the audit and all through the factory we were scrambling around changing our passwords. You can't do that, right?
Right.
You've got to get a head start, and they've given us plenty of notice. This is the year they've given us notice. This is the year to get yourself educated and started, and I commend everybody who's with us here today as participants. You guys are starting as of today. This is day 1, so we congratulate you on that, but boy, we got a lot to do, especially if level 3 is in your future you need to get
Absolutely.
you need to get after it. So, hey Zane, thanks so much for joining us today. It sure was helpful. Have a good day.
Well, I appreciate you having me, Scott. Take care.
All right. Boy, it was great to have Rick and Zane contributing to our conversation here today. We're going to cover the final two topics, timeline and cost. Let's start with the timeline. So the CMMC has been rolling out, shall we say, over a period of time, starting January of last year. Boy, that seems like another world ago, doesn't it? That'd be a pre-COVID date there. But the actual CMMC model itself, the requirements, were published in January. Then in March, the CMMC accreditation body, that's what CMMCAB stands for. That's the organization that qualifies the auditors, okay? They also oversee the trainers of the auditors and making sure audits have integrity. So they were launched in March of last year. Boy, an auspicious start to this, right? In March. Then in September, they began training the assessors. That continues to this day. It'll continue the rest of this year and going forward. To certify 350,000 companies, you think they're going to need a few thousand auditors, right? So it's going to take some time. That started in September. The DFARS Interim Rule appeared in November. The DIBCAC, or the score requirement, the score requirement as part of that 7019 clause was then required to receive awarded contracts as of December. January, they started to select the contracts that they're going to specify the very first CMMC certifications to be in. Those are called pilot certifications or programs, and they've already selected a few of those, and they're getting ready to release those later this year in the rollout. So this is kind of just giving you a snapshot of how this has been progressing. It's a little bit delayed due to the pandemic, but they're back on track, I think, and looking, as we look forward to it, I don't know, with anticipation or what otherwise, but it will be starting to hit the streets, as it were, later this year. It gives you a sense of that. Next, we'll talk about a little bit about preparation. How would we get ready? What kind of steps would we follow to prepare? On the screen, we'll put up 3 basic steps just to kind of wrap your head around what has to get done. The first is to learn the requirements, get some training, get educated, and do your self-assessment. So Rick had talked to us today about the importance of conducting a self-assessment based on the NIST 800-171, so you can submit that score, that all-important SPURS score that keeps you qualified to be awarded contracts. That's really where you would begin, and that includes developing your written SSP, System Security Plan, Plan of Action and Milestones, the POAM, build out a roadmap, if you will, to implement all the technical and non-technical controls. That would be the first phase. Learn those requirements, conduct that assessment. Second thing then would be to implement the changes, right? So there would be upgrades to your technology, perhaps, policies you have to put in place, training for your employees. Boy, this is sounding a lot like an ISO preparation, a little bit like that. But there's a number of things that for some companies could take a while, could take months to implement all the technical requirements and such, get your people ready. And you want to get that done long before the auditor is going to be there, which then brings us to certification phase 3. That's when the auditor actually comes to your facility and conducts the audit. And when everything has been corrected, you get the certification. So just kind of wrapping your head around this whole effort and initiatives. These are, for level 1, this might take 2 or 3 months to get done. I try to finish, a few months before the audit. So again, allow yourself time. And then 6 to 9 months minimum for level 3. Again, this is the year to start preparation. We're right now at the point where those assessments should get started. You want to stay qualified for SPURS under that SPURS submission to get contracts. This is the time to get that done. Now, all right, so now let's turn to our last topic, and that would be costs. What is all this going to cost? And I can't really quote that here today, but I can tell you some of the areas of cost. We'll put a list up here on the screen. We're going to have much more in-depth training later this year on cost and budgeting on all this. But you can see, there might be expenses with helping you get the assessments done or planning, budgeting. You might want to get a consultant involved. That's what we do. We're a consulting firm. You might want help to guide you through this whole process. So there could be expenses around getting some assistance along those lines. Upgrading your IT systems, another area of expense. Time, boy, that could be an expense for everyone to get the time to work on all this. And then the assessment itself, which would be a fee from the C3PAO. Now, of course, there's ongoing expenses. So, boy, we want to boil that down to more specific numbers. We'll do that in a future session, but that's what the areas we would look at. All right, we have time for a couple of questions, and if as we go through these sessions, I apologize for not mentioning it earlier. You could submit a question, but I'm going to ask Lori, our show producer here, to come online here. Lori, are you there?
I am.
All right, Miss Lori, thank you for watching the Q&A as it come in. Have we had a couple of questions maybe I could address quickly here?
We did have, Joe asked if he's a level 1 and in regard to the visitor log,
yeah,
if he has delivery people coming in, do they have to sign in and out? I mean, is it at that detail level, or is it for people that spend the day at the facility?
It's interesting. They don't tell us whether or not who it applies to in that regard. I would think that somebody dropping off a delivery would have no way to access any protected information. And so I wouldn't expect that to be a logged visitor, but anyone spending time in your offices or your factory certainly would.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do we have another one, or is that it for today?
Well, with the level 3, are you going to go into that in more detail? This was an anonymous question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We will be having an entire webinar later this year for level 3 in much more detail. Today is just kind of an awareness introductory session here today. So, well, thank you, Lori. Next month, when we have our next webinar, we'll allow for more time for questions. Feel free to email us at support@thecoursesolution.com if you have a question we can help with. So, thank you, Lori. Appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, let's let you know about some upcoming events that we're want to let you know about. Of course, this month was our introduction. Next month on May topic is on much more in depth about DoD assessments and SPRS submission. We're going to take the whole hour to go through that on May 6th and May 27th. You can see we're going to go for level 1 and level 3 in June and September. And we're going to take a little break over the summer. So you can see how that's scheduled. And we may come up with some other things to slide in there. I don't know. And then that budgeting webcast will be in October. And all about technology will be in November. The registration for these events is found on our website at the link you see there. You just go to thecoursesolution.com, select services, you'll go down to the webinars page. You'll be able to sign up for any of these. We really would appreciate you guys joining us. And we really want to thank our sponsors one more time. Boy, I appreciate everyone getting the word out about this event. I know our sponsors are just outstanding organizations at providing very useful information, helping you as companies get prepared. And the fact that you were invited to join us here today is really an impact on your business, and we really thank our partners for getting the word out here today. With that, we'll wrap for today. This has been a pleasure to have you guys join us on our inaugural CMMC webinar. It was great to have a couple of guests. We'll do it again next month. If you have someone who you didn't get to join us here today, we're going to have a second broadcast of this event later this month. Check our website. Listen, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next month.